and I think we can get started with some intros. So if you want to kick off, and then I will jump in, and then we'll get this started.
Yes, thank you, Jake. Thank you and Lakeside Insurance for sponsoring this workshop. My name is Audrey Sevalt, and I am an HR consultant for BBSI. We do a variety of services to include HR consulting, payroll. We do risk management, workers' compensation. We also offer business consulting as well. And we have a physical presence in the Denver metro area. And I've been an HR practitioner now for 40 years. So forever, since the early 80s, if you could imagine. So welcome, everybody. I am not an attorney, but I am a teacher. I do teach at the University of Denver as a professor for the Strategic HR program. And so I love sharing information. And I'll tell you the reason why I'm sharing this is because we're seeing a lot of wage disputes popping up among our small businesses that they're not prepared for. And part of it is the whole law is very complex and difficult to understand. So people are naive, and the agency doesn't care. It doesn't care that you don't know what you're doing with the wage and hour law. The agency expects everybody to follow it to the letter. So today, my goal is to walk you through, the whole wage and hour discussion. Jake, did you want to introduce yourself and talk about what you're going to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Audrey, and thanks for co-hosting this workshop with me today. So, like Audrey said, we're going to be talking about wage and hour rules in practice within Colorado. There's been a lot of changes that are going on, and that's kind of why we're here today. So my name is Jake Charon. I work for Lakeside Insurance. We're a privately owned insurance agency here in Colorado. We work with companies all over the state as well as outside of the state, as a lot of our clients have grown externally. We do property and casualty insurance. We can do health benefits as well. Audrey and I really partner together really well because what BBSI provides to their clients is similar to Lakeside. We want to be an outsourced risk manager. We want to help with your insurance program, but not really focusing on that because we want to help with the safety things, understanding employee handbooks, making sure that you're aware of what the laws are that are going on in our state because they're changing every single day. It's becoming harder and harder to be an employer in the state of Colorado. And so what we say at Lakeside is that it's not impossible to be in compliance, but it's improbable. So if you're not working with someone like Audrey to make sure that you're in compliance with all these different laws and regulations, it's going to be tough on a business and you could face some pretty large penalties. So we're going to walk through some things today. Audrey's going to give a lot of examples, things that she's actually been seeing over the last few months. And it's getting pretty scary out there. There's some large fines that companies have been getting hit with. People are kind of staying a little bit negligent or ignorant of the law, not thinking that it actually affects them, but it does. And we're going to learn a lot about that today. As I mentioned before, some of you got on. This meeting will be recorded. I will be sending a recording out. It'll also be on Lakeside's webinar page within our website. So if anyone within your company wants to view that, great, they can do that as well. And please, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, make sure to ask that. I know that there were some questions that people may or may not have asked on their way in for registering. So thank you for doing that. And again, we appreciate your time today, and please don't be afraid to kind of butt in and shoot something in the message, and I'll make sure to keep track of that while Audrey's moving on. So with further ado, Audrey, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, go ahead and advance the next slide, Jake. All right, so a little bit about why I think wage and hour is important. Let's go ahead and move on to all those bullet points there, Jake. So what we're seeing now is a lot of what's called wage disputes. And Jake, you can move all of there. You go. Up.
Yep. Sorry, we're getting caught up here.
It's okay. So a few of our businesses, I've seen 4 of them have these wage dispute forms, and I suspect that a lot of it has to do with social media. Somebody has somehow seen that it's easy cash to go to an employer if you feel that anyone owes you even an inkling of money. You fill out this, it's a state, by the way, it's by the state of Colorado. It's a wage dispute form, and it says you can have up to $7,500 paid to you by your employer if you feel that the employer has not followed all the wage and hour laws. All right. And so this is a great example. So I've seen 4 of them in the first quarter of 2025. And, this is kind of a shocker. Actually, one came from the city of Denver for one of our clients. And the city of Denver asked for 3 years of payroll records, including timesheets, when they got a wage dispute. And what the issue was there had to do with minimum wage in Denver versus minimum wage outside of Denver for a delivery driver. And this is, by the way, this is all news for me because I didn't know there were those kinds of nuances out there, which, I'll tell you more about in a little bit. But it had to do with if you have drivers going into the city of Denver, you should be paying attention to how long they're in the city. And this might be true for Boulder County, for Boulder, for Edgewater as well, with the differing minimum wages. If you have people making the state minimum wage, it adds the level of complexity. The other one, another one was over breaks and lunches. Actually, 2 of them were like that, where the employees had disputes over whether or not they were given all their breaks and lunches. And in the state of Colorado, if I don't get a break and I'm an hourly employee, you should pay me 10 minutes compensation for not getting that break. Okay. A lot of people don't know that. So imagine you're surprised when you get a letter like this and the employee says you owe me $7,500, which, by the way, is the maximum allowed on this form. So everybody's asking for $7,500. So what we're finding is employers are not prepared to handle these things. The city of Denver did one. I saw the state of Colorado do another one. And then the last 2 were just these employees filling out this form letter and delivering it to their employers to say, I have an issue, you owe me $7,500. So the risk to this is that you really don't know what to do when you see these things. And I would say now that if you need a formal request, you should work with an employment attorney. I have one that I work with, but I wouldn't advise you guys to respond on your own, particularly if you make a decision that I think is pretty risky. You really should have an attorney review that first. So go ahead, Jake, on to the next slide.
And Audrey, thank you for that. Just to slow you down and ask a question. So I know we're talking about minimum wage, but what about employees that are obviously required to carry that minimum salary that's continued to increase in Colorado? What if I'm being paid less than that salary amount? Am I able to potentially go after my employer?
Yes. Yeah. And that's the wicked thing about this. So I'll just go back to the city of Denver scenario. So this gentleman was making $15 an hour as a driver, which is pretty low, but it was above minimum wage. This was last year, above minimum wage. And I think that city of Denver is around I think it's $18 an hour. So he drives into Denver to deliver construction materials, and he spends more than 30 minutes there unloading the truck and putting everything on the ground for a construction site. And then he leaves. And he finds out that he should be paid the Denver minimum wage while he's out there, if he's out there more than 30 minutes. And by the way, I checked with the city of Denver to find out what the threshold was, and they said 30 minutes. So nobody knew that. And so what the employer did as a good faith effort, what he decided to do was to talk to the employee and say, all right, how many times, let's look at our records to see how many deliveries you've had and how long were you there. And they hashed it out, and they ended up giving him back pay, which resolved the issue. All right, so that's the easy way. They didn't pay him the $7,500. They went to him and they said, we think we owe you. And I think they ended up paying about $3,000 in back pay. And he was fine with that. So go ahead, Jake. Next slide. All right. Oh, and by the way, I will have links on this presentation and a handout because the state has the most complex, you can see here, so many resources that you'll be able to link them yourself and read them yourself. All right, so poll question for you. How many of these documents provide information? You've got the employment poster. I'm assuming all of you have the employment poster, right? I hope. You should have one. There are 22 documents in the Colorado Department of Labor website that talks about wage and hour law. And then to top that off, you've got Wage Order 39, which is about 19 pages that talks about wage and hour law. And you have about 54 information sheets on the Department of Labor website that go into more vivid detail about certain scenarios, like what about uniforms? What about drivers? What about, it's like every kind of thing. So I wonder if all of you are at the last bullet there. I have no idea, but you're scaring me. When I did my webinar the last time, pretty much everybody said that. So advance to the next slide there, Jake. So it is daunting to see. So why is there so much regulation? I'm going to play historian and teacher for a moment. Go back, Jake. Backslide. Okay, why is that? Well, back in the early 20th century, there was a lot of unions out there, and manufacturing. In the world of manufacturing, there were things like child labor. A lot of factory workers or workers that were in large employers worked long hours, and they also didn't get paid overtime. The average work week was not 40 hours; it's probably more like 60, 80 hours a week. And so there were a lot of issues. And as the unions were gaining power, they were pushing for a more reasonable approach to what work should look like. And so in 1939, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that act made a lot of big changes to the way work was that we still follow today. One was if you work over 40 hours in a work week, you get paid time and a half for overtime. That was per the FLA. That's a federal law, by the way. The second one is that there can be child labor has great limitations. You can't have a 10-year-old working in a factory all day. There are stipulations, and there are some exceptions like agriculture where children can work, but there are a lot of rules around child labor now. Also, that you can't deduct wages for things. Back then, before FLSA, the company stores, people would use their paychecks to pay for food and things if they worked in a company where they had a company store, and they would end up being far more in debt than they would ever pay back. So to the eyes of Congress, they thought that was almost the equivalent of enslavement. And so they said, you can't do that. You can't have these deductions of wages that are so astronomical, the employee will never repay the debt. So there's a lot of regulation around payroll deductions. And then how people are terminated. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. And the federal law is somewhat less complex than the state law. But it was all tied to social change behind changing the workplace from one that was somewhat difficult to one that we have today, which is you get 40 hours, you get paid more. It's not the same as it was in the early 20th century. So go on to the next slide there, Jake.
Yeah, and I want to jump in for a second too, Audrey, because it's interesting that the Fair Labor Standards Act, I read a lot about it. I studied a lot about it when understanding employment practices liability insurance, because you'll sometimes see FLSA or the Fair Labor Standards Acts on an employment practices liability policy. A lot of companies have gone to what they call now wage and hour coverage. So again, if you don't have an employment practices liability policy and you think that your little $25,000 limit on the general liability policy you're paying for is enough, it's not. Just because they can get the $7,500 off of you as an employer doesn't mean that they can't sue you for negligence as an employer as well. So that's just a way to get out the $7,500, but they can still sue you for that. Most employment practices liability policies don't have wage and hour or Fair Labor Standard Acts coverage. And if they do, it's maximum to usually, if you have $1 million policy, they're only willing to pay about $150,000 to $250,000 because it's the number one area in which claims happen. Because again, it's so hard to keep up with all these different laws and regulations, but there are insurance policies that can cover you for that. Depending on the size of your business, the class of business, what you do, the premium is obviously going to vary, but $5,000 for a policy that can cover you for $1 million in defense and $250,000 to pay out for wage and hour is serious. So if your insurance agent isn't talking to you about that and you're paying hundreds of $1,000s for your general liability and property and auto, do they really care about your business, or do they just want your premium? So again, it's these smaller policies that I'm finding that a lot of large companies don't have in place because they quote unquote don't think it can affect them. And as we're learning today from Audrey, it's not just going to affect you, it's going to be painful too. Because once this happens to one employee, they're going to start telling all their friends. And same with what the attorneys are doing too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't want to scare you too much at this point. I just want to educate, but I walk you through ways that you can mitigate that risk too, in terms of practice. Now, if you have an employment poster, you will find that there are two minimum wages. One is $7.25, which is the federal FLSA or Fair Labor Standards Act wage. And then you've got the minimum wage in Colorado, which is $14.81. And you may even see on your poster, the city of Denver. It just, there's so many minimum wages. And the reason for that is because there's a federal law and a state law, and now you have city laws to add to the mix. State law and city laws trump the federal law. And typically they're more rigorous than the federal law. So the federal law, you'll see it's the same for all 50 states. So in Wyoming, I believe, their minimum wage is $7.25. All right, so you'll see that all over, but that's why you see two different minimum wages, why it's so confusing, but that's the way it is in the world. And I would just ignore the federal law and focus on the state law. Go ahead, Jake, to the next slide. Again, you can advance to all the bullets here. So what is wage and hour law? Let's just do some basic information. It decides, the law mandates what jobs should be hourly or salary, all right? Not up to you. There are some what is called exemption guidelines. So exemptions mean that the job itself is exempt from overtime. All right, so that means I would be salary. No matter how many hours I work, I get the same pay. Hourly, on the other hand, is I get paid overtime. It also tells you how overtime is calculated. Time and a half, typically. You could have more than that. Nobody's going to fuss if you decide to pay more than overtime, and some companies do that. In the state of Colorado, not the federal law, there is a mandate for breaks and lunches for hourly employees, not salary. Salary, it doesn't matter. But for hourly employees, it's very particular. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. It also mandates when you pay the final paycheck upon termination in the state of Colorado. It also, the Wage and Hour Department of Labor in Colorado also manages the paid sick leave, or what we call Healthy Family Workplace Act, or HFWA. You probably are acquainted with that. That's the mandated 48 hours per year of paid sick leave that every employee in Colorado should be entitled to, and they accrue at 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. So that's also managed by the Department of Labor. On to the next, oh yes, and then of course, you've got minimum wages for the city as well, these cities, and I think if I were going to put my crystal ball on my head, I would say that's coming. I could see Larimer County or potentially Fort Collins having a new minimum wage. Aurora almost had one. If you Google it, you'll see that it actually was on Google, but it didn't happen because the city council voted it down. But I anticipate, much like California, you can have lots of different city minimum wages, which adds a level of complexity. Also, the Wage and Hour Division expects very meticulous record keeping. And for one of the clients that I had, their record keeping did not meet the legal requirements, and they suffered some fines for that. So record keeping is absolutely important. We'll talk more about that. And then, of course, you also have to pay wages that are earned, and it's agreed upon by the employer and the employee. So that gets really messy, where if you have an offer letter, you say, I'm going to pay you X, you pay them less, that could become an issue. Or you say, I'm going to deduct a certain amount of wages for things like uniforms, which is not legal, by the way. You just have to be cognizant that there are a lot of things that are tied to what you and the employee agree upon with regard to wages earned. And then, of course, the mandate for transparency. So your pay statement should show, if I'm an hourly employee, how many hours I worked, how many overtime hours I worked, what deductions were done by taxes and benefits. So that is mandated by law. Okay, go ahead, Jake, to the next slide. And of course, I have all these links for you to look for yourself and see what you think of all this stuff. What I would say Wage Order 39 it offers the best information on is what exemptions, what jobs are exempt from overtime. Are they administrative? Are they based on supervisory roles? Are they based on professional degrees? Those kinds of things. So if you need to get a sense of what salaried people what jobs are salaried, you look on Wage Order 39 to get that information. All right, so on to the next slide there, Jake. All right, so let's talk about some problems that pop up along the way. We think it's a good idea. Let's make this person salaried. So exempt means I'm exempt from overtime. I don't get breaks and lunches are not tracked. You should not track salaried people's time unless it's tied to projects or things that you want to bill for. But you don't say you need to be in at 8 and clock in, you need to be out at 5 and clock out, and you need to, I'm going to pay attention because it's a quack like a duck scenario to the Wage and Hour Division. If you look like an hourly employee, then you are an hourly employee, and you probably aren't getting the overtime that you need to be paid. That's how they think. So I would say follow the state's exemption guidelines. And so the examples include, go ahead to the advance there, the administrative, which is, I have a very wide variety of office. Like think of an office manager. I might be exempt based on the variety of work I do and the level of authority that I have. Executives or supervisors, I have the right to hire, fire. Professionals, I have to have an advanced degree. Outside salespeople, I have to be out of the office for a significant period of time selling. And of course, owners get nothing. They can never be hourly if they're salaried. So, and there's more than that. There's a whole lot of, like, what about ski operators, in the ski areas? Some of them are exempt. So wage order 39 provides you all that information. I had a situation where somebody was hired for this small company. He said, I want to be salaried. Why? Because I like being salaried. I prefer that. And so they made him salaried. And then he turned in one of those wage dispute forms and said, hey, you owe me breaks and lunches. You didn't give me breaks and lunches, you owe me breaks. And we looked at it, and you know what? He should have been hourly, because they didn't follow any exemption guidelines. They didn't look it up. They said, since you want it, we'll give it to you. And they ended up giving him back pay. So that's an example where you don't listen to people, you follow what the exemption guidelines are, and you decide based on the responsibilities who should be salaried and who not, who shouldn't be. If the wage and hour division had it their way, everybody would be hourly. Everybody. They don't like salary. So, all right. So poll question, what would you say? I'm going to just see if Jake, you're going to tell me which one is right. You say, okay, I want to be salaried. Sure, you're a great employee. I'll make you salaried. No raise, of course. You'll make enough with $22 an hour. Or nope, there's strict guidelines to what jobs are salaried, and your job does not fit those sorry categories. Sorry. Sure, I know it would make you happy, but no overtime anymore. So which one is the right answer, Jake?
Oh, you're going to put it on me?
Yeah.
Well, if an employee is going to be asking if they should be salaried instead of hourly, I would make sure that they understand what all the different rules are. So I feel like the first two are a bit of a trick because they don't get disguised. So I would say that B is probably going to be the best option, that there's strict guidelines to that.
Yep, that's right. You
And
said no.
I do want to ask a question too, because I know that I feel like it's kind of old school business where you're a salaried employee, and I know that even people at our company do this. They'll say, oh, I need to take my lunch, or you take your lunch at this time and I'll take mine at this time, or I need to be there at 8 and I need to leave there at 5. So what's kind of your take on that? And could there be something within an employee handbook that somebody signed that said Jake gets 30 minutes for lunch a day, or Jake gets an hour for lunch a day? Because I feel like it's the old fashioned way of looking at business, but it doesn't seem to be technically correct if you quote unquote deserve a lunch or should take your full hour, or what exactly that means when you are salaried and not hourly.
Right. All right. So good question. Now, I'm going to use my business hat for a minute, and I'm going to use my human hat. Okay. So my human hat says, yeah, you should take breaks to go to the restroom and take a lunch and get rested. I mean, it makes you a better worker, right? I mean, you feel better. It's not right not to take lunch. Now I'm going to talk to you about the business side. Yeah, but you got a lot more work to do than you have time for, and you're paid for the work that you do, not the time you put in. Now, with that, I can say that if you're required to be in some place at a certain time, like an office, you're manning an office, and the office opens at 8 and closes at 5, you can say to a salaried employee, you got to be in the office during those times. You just can't say you have to work 8 to 5. All right. You say you work based on the work you have to do. So sometimes you can say you have to be in a certain place by a certain time, like during business hours. And you can say breaks and lunches are good. Please take them, because you're paid for the work that you do. If I take excessive breaks and excessive lunches, I'm not keeping up with my job. Therefore, that becomes a performance issue, not a timekeeping issue. So how do you like that? Two different answers.
No, that was great. It was a fully loaded question, and I would say it's easier when you have good employees that are respectful and want to get their work done relative to people that try to take advantage of the system, which we see every day.
It happens. It's been a performance issue. All right. What are some flawed reasons? Go ahead and advance the slides there. All right. This is what I've heard businesses actually say. It's like, no. Because you can't manage your bunks or their lunches. They're in the field. I've talked to the wage and hour division about that, because I had a client who was really unhappy with the fact they have employees in the field, and how in the heck are we supposed to track them when they can't have a supervisor there all the time? The answer that the wage and hour division said is, we don't care. You guys have plenty of technology out there where you can track this stuff. You just need to figure out how to make it work. You have time tracking systems, you've got phone apps, but we expect you to make sure they're taking lunches. All right. And if they take breaks, and let's say you're out in the field and you don't get a break, you're nice enough where you say to the employee, if you didn't get your break, please let us know so we can pay you that extra 10 minutes. And if it ends up being abusive, where people choose not to take their breaks or they don't follow the policy, it becomes a policy issue in your handbook where it says you have to take your breaks, you have to take your lunches for hourly employees, and you're not, that is a policy issue. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Also, you can't convert an employee to salary because they want it or because you're paying too much overtime. That's a big red flag to the wage and hour division. It's more convenient, or because you're completely unaware, which is true for most people, of the exemption guidelines. You can't convert them to salary for these reasons, all right? It's got to be based on the job. And here's where it is, wage order 39, and actually it's number 2. You got 1.1, you go all the way, scroll down to number 2, and it shows you all the exemption guidelines you can see. So you look at the job. My advice is have a job description on hand. You probably need that anyway, because the Department of Labor also has a law called Equal Pay for Equal Work, which mandates that you have job descriptions for all your jobs. So you should have a job description, and then you look at it based on those exemption guidelines to make a decision.
Well, and not just a job description, Audrey, but was it last year or 2 years ago that Colorado required that any job that you're posting, you need to put a salary range on there as well, or else you're out of compliance?
Yeah, well, that's equal pay for equal work, which is a wicked little law that I don't even want to talk about because it makes people hopping mad. But yes, you should have your jobs posted with pay ranges and listing all your benefits on the, and by the way, they are fining businesses for not doing that. I think what the agency has is a small enforcement division that goes out there and trolls all the ads, and they fine them. And the biggest fine so far this year was, I think it had to be, I'm not sure, a big company, at least $25,000, if not more.
Which is the cost to hire an employee too.
Yeah. So yeah, don't ignore that law. But that's a whole other topic besides wage and hour law. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, minimum wage for salaried employees. It has gone up every year. If you have salaried employees, you suffered through this. From 2020 to 2024, it was $5,000 a year, killing everybody. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And so many companies converted salary employees to hourly employees because they just couldn't afford the $5,000 a year increase. Last year, it was what they call cost of living. And right now, it went from $555 to $56485, or $1,086.25 per week. And it's going to continue to go up every year. I don't know by how much, but finally the businesses are saying, hey, this is crazy. You can't do this. But in California, it's close to 80,000 minimum wage out there.
And again, if you're on this call and you have salaried employees that are making less than $56,485 for the year, you are out of compliance and could potentially face penalties. So
yes, yeah. And I can't say it's rare that you get, aside from these wage disputes, the wage and hour division does not go out there and go after you. They usually, and this is what they told me too, it's usually because it's an employee complaint or a former employee complaint that gets the companies in hot water.
Or there's an attorney that knows the loopholes and they just start reaching out to employees because maybe they went online and saw that a company's posting salary jobs for $45K and can make a little money for themselves and the employee.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways. So we don't want you to be vulnerable. So let's talk about overtime. Overtime is, I want to see if you get this right. Jake, you're on the spot. Go to the next slide here. Let's see if you get this right. All right, which was false? In Colorado, you can pay overtime through comp time, anything over 40 hours in a week, anything over 12 hours in a day, or time and a half. And you can have more than one response. Which one is false?
We can pay over 40 hours a week. We can pay, I think C is false. 12 hours a day is more than a work day.
Correct.
We can pay time and a half.
Yeah, so Colorado has a law that mandates that you pay anything over 12 hours in a day, you pay time and a half. And that's one of those trivia questions that no one knows. The one that is false is comp time. So comp time is when I say to you, okay, I know you work 3 hours overtime. How about this? How about if I pay you that in time off next week? I'll give you 3 extra days off or 3 extra hours off next week. That is not legal in the state of Colorado. It is legal in other states, but not in Colorado. So don't even think about providing comp time. It used to be a practice for many years that companies did to get around overtime, and it's not okay in the state. So on to the next slide. I stumped you, Jake. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, you did. You got me on that one. It's tricky because the work week is 40 hours, but if you're working 40 hours, you're not doing 12 hours a day. You're doing less than that.
Yeah. So if you worked over 12 hours, let's say you work 13 hours one day, and you work 40 hours, you're still owed 1 hour of overtime, right? Because you worked over 12 hours.
Trick
All right,
question.
so, yep, I know, I love doing those. All right, so let's move on. So overtime is 1.5 times regular pay. If the pay varies, and I've seen that where you pay people different rates for driving or different types of jobs, then you use what's called a weighted average, and there's guidance on that. Federal law is over 40 hours in a work week, so you have to declare what your work week looks like. It's Sunday through Saturday or Monday through Sunday. It's 7 days, not 5. And then in Colorado, again, it's over 12 hours in a work day, or all hours worked in excess of 12 hours without regard to the starting and ending time of the workday. So if I worked, 12 hours one day and then I came back 6 hours later and worked another 6, I may be owed a lot of overtime. And of course, there's all kinds of info sheets on how that's calculated. All right. So, and don't worry, I've got more links on a handout for you too. So on to the next slide. So that's overtime. So, all right, Jake.
False.
You did, yes, absolutely. And I dropped some hints. Okay, and there's a hand. James has a question.
All right, James, what question do you have? You could throw it in the Q&A if you prefer. Maybe it was an accident.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide, and he can go ahead and do the Q&A.
Yeah, and if you do have questions, everyone, please use the Q&A box.
Perfect. Let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to get through this in an hour. Oh, it says microphone is disabled. Okay. Okay, so I know this is a loaded question, but yes, our lives are complicated in Colorado. So go ahead and go on to the next slide.
Yep, and I just threw a chat in the Q&A, James, so you can do that because the microphones are muted.
All right, so minimum wage in Denver is so variable. It's ridiculous. It's actually getting more ridiculous every year. So now we have the city of Denver, and what is okay, so I'm going to keep going. Jake, could you move on to the next slide?
Yeah, you keep going. I'll handle that.
Okay, on to the next slide. So this shows you, this actually comes from the wage and hour, it's the website, the Department of Labor website. It shows you all the minimum wages. In Colorado, it's $14.81. Statewide, city, it's $18.81. These are all going up every year. And then, of course, Edgewater's got its own. Boulder County has one. City of Boulder has one. And so, that adds a level of confusion. And then you can see that it's gone up. If you look at 2024, it's gone up quite significantly. And so my advice to you, what I've told my clients just to make their lives easier is if you've got people going in and out of Denver, just pay them Denver minimum wage. If you can't, it's not affordable, then track it so closely that if there's ever a wage dispute, you can show, because the burden of proof is on the employer to prove that they did not violate the law. All right. So it would behoove you to keep meticulous records on when people are in and out of Denver. But nowadays, what I see most of them doing, most of my businesses are doing, is they're paying Denver minimum wage, and people are floating in and out of Denver quite a bit as part of their jobs.
Yeah, because it might be more expensive to track that rather than just pay the additional few dollars.
Right. But Boulder and Boulder County are another little quagmire along with Edgewater. So it's just things to pay attention to, that when they're in those cities more than 30 minutes, you need to pay them those minimum wage if you're not paying them. If you're paying them less than, or if you're paying the state minimum wage, you just have to make sure you're following those minimum wages.
And they try to make it a pain too. 5 cents difference between Edgewater and Boulder County.
I know.
And then the city of Boulder is exactly $1 less. So I mean, it's very easy to make these mistakes.
I just love these legislators. They have no idea what they're doing. All right, so let's talk about breaks and lunches, because that's a little hairy animal that we just think, I'm just going to let employees manage that themselves. And in fact, that's not easy to do. So as you can see here, the state of Colorado has mandated that you should list out all the possible breaks over a 24-hour period. And again, it's a 10-minute break minimum. If you give 15, that's nice of you. It's for every 4 hours of work. And you can't, let's see what James has to say here.
All right. So the question from James, thanks for typing that out. My employee chooses to do more work one week so they can work less the next. For example, they have 48 hours in a week, but next week they have 20 hours. Their choice. Do I still have to pay the 1.5 overtime?
Yes. And I'm assuming this person's hourly. You absolutely have to pay them overtime.
Sounds like it's
So
probably a better situation to go into a salaried employee then, because it's more get your work done when you can, but that's
depends on
might
what the
not.
job is. It depends on what, remember, that depends on what the job is. So my advice is that you make it a policy question versus, a legal question, and say to them, you're expected to work 40 hours, and I appreciate that you put in an extra 8 hours, but that doesn't work. You can't, that's a comp time. That is a comp time situation that person's trying to do. You cannot do that. So you say, I will pay you whatever you work. You've got to pay whatever someone has worked. That is absolutely, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, because that's what stung one of my business owners. They weren't doing this, and they got fined $5,000 for not tracking time worked. All right.
Yeah,
So
nuts.
just, you got to be careful. So yeah, so breaks happen every four. You can't have them leave early or take a long lunch. James, you can convert them if you look at the exemption guidelines and the job meets those criteria. Okay. And then if they don't take a break, you have to pay them 10 minutes. You have to pay them 10 minutes. And this is a big issue. This is bigger than you realize. When employees file, this is where a couple of the claims came in, the wage disputes. You didn't pay me my 10 minutes break that I didn't get. And because you're not hovering over them, watching them, how would you know, right? So this is something that, as a matter of policy, my advice to you is that if you have these people working out in the field where you can't track when they're taking 10-minute breaks, you tell them they have to, and then you're really nice about it, as I said before, if they don't take it, to let you know, and you'll pay them. But then if it becomes a practice, it becomes a policy issue for you, which might mean you have to counsel them and coach them and potentially warn them for not following company policy. Does that make sense? All right, so on the lunch. All right, so I love the duck analogy because that's how the wage and hour division thinks. A lot of companies like the idea of saying, I'm going to auto deduct lunches. And I'm not, I don't have a process for employees to tell me whether or not they took their lunch, or I tell them to take a lunch and they have no lunch, no lunch, no lunch, no lunch. That is a quack like a duck scenario where the division believes that if you're not following the law, which is laid out here, you're the employer are creating an illegal practice. All right, so the law says lunches are mandatory for they work over 5 hours. Ideally, 30 minutes unpaid. It's nice of you if you want to pay them, but it should be at least 30 minutes unpaid. If the employee is on duty, they should be paid. Again, no lunches are okay once in a while, but if it's all the time, it's a flawed employment practice. And skipping lunches can be indicative of not allowing lunches, which is
And
also not compliant with the law.
Audrey, I have a question about this too, because I've heard companies having to deal with this. Let's say that I'm an hourly worker. I work over obviously the 5 consecutive hours, so I need to be taking my minimum lunch. But let's say that I don't decide to take my lunch until 4:30 p.m. and my job ends at 5. So then I just leave work at 4:30. What do you end up doing in a situation like that, if anything you can as an employer?
Well, you're violating, first of all, you're allowing a violation of the law to happen because it says you have to provide 30 minutes over 5 consecutive hours. So I should be taking a lunch after I've worked 5 hours, okay? And if you're not doing it till 4:30, it's really not compliant with the law. And it's intended to take a break, all right? So
Looks like
you
Kate's
really
raising
should.
her hand.
I see that. Hi, Kate. Well, I'll let you type the question and we'll go on to the next slide for the sake of time. But the quack like a duck scenario is what they live by in the wage and hour division.
All right, let's talk about record keeping.
Yes, this is a hot potato, by the way. The gold standard, if the wage and hour division could control the world, is they would have every hourly employee has a timesheet. The timesheet has the dates, the time I punched in, the time I punched out for lunch, the time I punched in from lunch, and the time I punched out for the day. And every day I track my time in terms of how many hours I worked, if I had overtime, if I used sick, if I used vacation. It's tracked in such a way. And then on the bottom of the document, I sign it as the employee and my supervisor signs. That is the gold standard. Now, we all know that that doesn't work nowadays with technology. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. But that's what they expect. All right, that's what they want. So like I said, I called the wage and hour division, but my poor business owner just couldn't believe that he's expected to track time that meticulously. This is the one that paid the $5,000 fine. And the harsh reality is, and by the way, they just don't care about anyone complaining about how unrealistic the record keeping is because they say the law mandates it. You got to be careful. You can do auto lunch deductions, but you've got to make sure that employees have a process to follow if they did not take a lunch. I still think, my opinion, that auto deductions are risky, but I understand the operational reasons, but I would be really careful to make sure employees are fully aware of contacting their manager if they don't get a lunch or a break. There should be regular discussions about breaks and lunches because people forget and fall into some bad habits. And by the way, the employee could choose to fall into those bad habits like I'll leave at 4:30, but if they have a dispute with you, guess whose fault that is? It's the employer's because you're not following the law, even though the employee's choosing to do that. If you ever get a wage dispute, in addition to contacting an attorney for a response, you need to address them as soon as possible. Now, you could do it informally with the employee and say, what, $7,500, can you tell me how you came up with that number? And they go, oh, well, it's a guess. Okay, let's walk through timesheet day by day. What breaks did you miss? What overtime did you, and you almost you go through a full discussion of where the missing hours are in a way where you're helping, you want to solve the problem. Because if they don't get what they want, which typically is less than 7,500, in two cases that we had with this wage dispute, the employees were fine with less than 7,500, as long as they had a full conversation with their supervisor about what was owed. They did get some back pay, but it wasn't that much. But you should deal with it as soon as you can. And then if employees choose not to follow your policy in taking breaks and lunches, deal with it as a performance issue and document it. That is not a retaliatory thing. You're trying to help them comply with the law because you're on the hook when they're not following the law. So you have every right to go to them and say, that is not okay with me. You got to take your lunches. If you choose not to take your lunches, I will give you a warning, up to and including termination if you choose not to take a lunch, because there's a lot at stake for the business if you don't take that type of action.
Right.
Okay, on.
We got Kate's question, but I think what's important that Audrey just said is documentation. Just like everything in business, if you aren't documenting certain things and keeping track of issues that have happened, and then all of a sudden you just want to make an issue about it, how do we know that it ever happened? So documentation is key.
Yes, it is,
All
because
right.
you have to prove you did the right thing. All right, on to the next slide.
So here we got Kate's question. I'll ask that before we jump in. So
Okay.
Kate said, do employees on piece rate / work orders have to be paid overtime? For example, we give a guy a work order for $3,000 for 1 week to complete a job.
Piece rate is a wicked little animal, and I would suggest that you look at the piece rate regulation. There's an info sheet for that. And make sure that if you went to the wage and hour division, the way they see piece rate is as long as the employee is making minimum wage for hours worked, we're good with piece rate. Well, you're not tracking hours. So, I mean, this is where you got to really look at this, look at the law carefully and make sure that you're paying at least the minimum wage for time worked. And if you're above and beyond that, your piece rate is fine. But look at the law. Okay.
And looking at that, I mean, the 3K, because we went back to that other slide, it talks about right around $1,200 for that weekly amount. So you would be in compliance, Kate. But yeah, it is, you do have to be careful, obviously.
Somebody else, I think Cynthia raised her hand.
Yeah, I see Cynthia, so I'll have her
drop
her question in the chat, and we'll keep pushing along here.
Yeah, so like I said, I was just outraged that the agency would expect people to track time on the field to that degree of detail, and they said they got to keep timekeeping systems in. They got to have a system where people punch in, punch out for lunch, punch back in for work, punch out for the day. That is a mandate. And there are a lot of apps out there that are free to or no cost to you as the employer that can help track people's time. But the key to this is to be nice about it. Put it in your handbook. Explain to employees what what they have to do as part of their job is to track time. So let's move on to the next slide there. And I think technology can really help you. And we have, of course, BBSI has a time tracking system. We're going to skip to the next slide because most of you are not our clients. But
But
there
if
are
you
some
want to
great
be,
apps.
you can get on there.
Yeah, that's right. We do have a system. So what's some best practices? All right. So make sure that whatever system you have is punching in and out for the day, punching in and out for lunches, because you have to keep, and you have to keep this as a legal record. All right. You also should make sure that if the employee has a dispute over their time, you deal with it quickly. Avoid any alternate methods. I actually saw one, which oh God, I knew it was going to be bad. When there was on a work order, you had the employees that were on the crew listed by name, and it said 8 hours every day, which again, quack like a duck analogy is like, that's not possible. How do they work exactly at? So it's not accurate to the wage and hour division. No oversight, making sure that people are punching in at their time is accurate, and lack of awareness among employees. So you as the employer are required to keep meticulous records. Now, let me just say this. With the city of Denver scenario, where they had to give their records, and this poor client had to give 3 years worth of records, no fines, no payout of $7,500. Why? Because they had meticulous timekeeping records to show the timesheets where they looked like these people were really punching in and out, and the pay records reflected accurate pay. So the wage and hour division, and Denver is not a nice division, by the way. They're actually hostile to employers, in my opinion. But they said, we agree with the employer. They don't owe you any more money. And that had to do with their record keeping. All right, on to the next slide. And I think Cynthia still has a question, right?
Yep,
No?
I'm waiting for her to throw it in the chat.
Okay, no worries. Let's talk about PTO, vacation, and paid sick time. A little quagmire there. I suggest you take a look at the Healthy Family Workplace Act paid sick leave law. It should be on your legal poster. Some things to remember. Remember, it's the 48 hours per year. You have to roll over 48 hours every year. You can't have a use it or lose it policy. You can't ask for a doctor's note unless somebody's been out 4 consecutive days. And you should state in your policy that you do not pay HFWA out upon termination. All right. And then you can have, it's up to you, but you can have a PTO or vacation policy of your own. And whatever you mandate in your policy is now considered almost a contract that you must follow. So that if you ever have an employee with a dispute, the first thing the wage and hour division would ask for is your policy. So you should follow your policy to the letter once you declare it. So you can declare whatever you want in the policy. As long as you don't have paid sick leave included in there, you could wait 90 days or 6 months or whatever. If you combine sick leave and PTO, you have to follow the HFWA paid sick leave rule, which is 1 hour for every 30 hours worked at a minimum. You can have more than that if people have been around the company longer. You cannot, under PTO policy, vacation policy, have a use it or lose it policy. That used to be allowed. Last year, the state outlawed that, which means you have 3 choices as to what to do with people who have big vacation balances. You can opt to pay them out in cash, because it's now considered earned wages, all right? Or you can force them to take time off, or you can roll it over for up to 1 year. So you just have to be cognizant that you can't take it away, which is, again, a violation of the law. You have to pay out PTO or vacation upon termination. And it should be tracked. It should be tracked in some way so that you and the employee agree that it's accurate. And if you want to save money and you have PTO policies, I'm advising clients to separate out the paid sick leave, since it doesn't mandate being paid out upon termination, and only have a vacation policy that says, if you leave the company, we'll pay out your vacation. The reason why I'm not a big fan of PTO is that it's confusing to people. PTO usually includes, paid sick leave. So that's why we don't like it. Another loophole in the law. And by the way, I'm fully expecting the state to outlaw this in some way, but for now it is completely accepted. Unlimited PTO. So unlimited PTO is very popular among younger workers. If you look at the job ads in many companies, they advertise unlimited PTO. It's not truly unlimited. Let me just say that. You have to have a very defined policy that has parameters. For example, if you have peak business, like the end of the year is peak business, nobody can take pay time off, okay? You can limit it to 2 weeks at once. You can't be gone for months. You can say there's got to be business reasons, there's got to be performance issues. You do not have to pay it out upon termination. But the catch to this is, when I spoke to the wage and hour division about this, because I'm actually really worried about unlimited PTO becoming outlawed, but what they said was, one thing they're worried about is that unlimited PTO, if you have enough parameters, nobody will take time off. And I actually have seen this in many unlimited PTO policies where employees don't take all their time off. I don't know why, but they just don't do it. Or they use it excessively to the point where it's not reasonable. So what they said is reasonable is 2 weeks a year. If you make sure that employees take at least 2 weeks of unlimited PTO a year, you're fine. And then they need to be eligible for it immediately to offset the HFWA paid sick leave. And the other thing you need to remember is, what if they want to go on family leave? How does unlimited PTO work for that? You can lay out parameters for that. You could, most of my companies, what they do is they say we allow for up to 2 weeks of unlimited PTO to offset family leave. That would cover benefits, premiums. So if I'm paid 50% family, I might want to use 50% of my 2 weeks of PTO while I'm on family leave to pay for my benefits and still get a paycheck from you guys. So those are all parameters that you can work around, and we can certainly offer you a template as an idea for you to start with. But just what you want to make sure to be fully compliant is to make sure employees get 2 weeks of PTO off a year. All right, termination. So there are some parameters around, legal parameters around termination. If I resign, you're not obligated to pay me until the next pay period. However, if I'm terminated involuntarily, you have to pay me within 24 hours if your checks are generated in-house, or 48 hours if it's processed by offsite payroll companies such as BBSI. All right, so those are things to remember. I know sometimes people want to give people their paychecks immediately. As just if you have an offsite payroll company, you have 2 days to do that. All right, but make sure you follow those parameters, because you're not, then it's a violation of the law. And again, full transparency on their pay stubs. How much PTO did we owe you? How much overtime did we owe you? You want to make sure you have that all in the paycheck. The other piece to this is what's called an employer separation form. That was enacted back in 2023. And it mandated, I haven't seen any penalties for this, so I'm not absolutely sure that this is something where you can get in trouble for. But the employer separation form is a state form that says the reason I was terminated was, and you check the box, voluntary, involuntary, laid off, blah, blah, blah. And I would advocate that you put nothing more than that. Do not give people a letter saying, here are all the reasons why we terminated you, because that's almost giving someone a nice little thing to hand over to their attorney that they can fight. So just fill out the form with just the basics and hand it to every employee who leaves the company. So, and the reason for this form is so that it's easy for people to file unemployment, which is kind of sad, but true. All right, did we get Cynthia's question?
She did not put it in the chat, so we'll see if it comes in. We got 7 more minutes.
All right, so employee and equipment and uniforms. All right, so for a long time, the wage and hour division, you had no rights as the employer to recoup any dollars lost for people not turning in their laptops or their phones. That's crazy. So they made a change that was a little bit more reasonable, but not by much, okay? So what you have to do is, if you give an employee a laptop or a cell phone, you've got to notify them up front with a payroll form, some kind of, we have one for BBSI, we could certainly provide you guys if you want it, but it's a form that says the phone is worth $1,000. All right, if you leave the company, you have to turn it back in. If you don't turn it in, we will deduct the market value of that equipment on the day of your termination on your final paycheck. And that's the only time you can collect for that, okay? It used to be you had to go to small claims court. But the market value is key here. You can't take $1,000 and take it back. You have to look and see what the market value is of the equipment and then take that deduction. But you got to have an upfront agreement with the employee as to what that deduction looks like. What I like about having a deduction form up front is it make employees think twice about stealing your equipment, because you're going to take back the market value. You're going to take something out of their paycheck that they don't want you to take. So it's not a bad thing operationally to do, but that's the only way you can take those kinds of things. Uniforms, it depends. And I advise you to look at info sheet 16, because in some cases you can deduct for uniforms, in other cases you can't. So take a look at the info sheet to know for sure. The other thing has to do with minors. So minors have a lot of rights, particularly if they're in school. There's an info sheet 22 that tells you things like they can't do certain jobs, like they can't operate trash compactors. They can't work more than 8 hours on a school day. They have all kinds of these requirements on that info sheet. And by the way, the federal agencies have similar minor regulations that you have to follow. All right. So you got to make sure that if you hire anybody under the age of 18, take a look at these minor info sheets so you know that you're complying with wage and hour law. Also, we did talk a little about equal pay for equal work. And again, like we said, job postings are key. There's a whole lot of other stuff like posting internally, notifying employees who filled the position and the career path that got to get to that position. All of that is in the info sheets for equal pay for equal work, which was enacted in 2022. So lessons learned. I think you need to know the law. I mean, the agencies, if you went to the agency and said, I didn't know that, they go, we don't care. You should know that. And now we're going to fine you. I mean, that's how they think. And then you have to have some really good policies. If you need help, I'm happy to help you, but make sure you have a good handbook that complies with wage and hour law and check it every year. If you have wage and hour disputes or need help, contact an attorney because they can provide you good advice on what to do. I think you should, as dry as the reading is, read Wage Order 39. You'll be amazed at what you find out there. And then I would say, as I mentioned with Jake, look to some other options to protect yourselves from potential risk mitigation to make sure that you don't get yourself in a situation where you owe $15,000 for fines and back pay for an employee. We don't want to see that happen to anyone at all. It's a worst case scenario. So anything you can do there to protect yourselves. These laws are always changing too. So we do offer legal updates every year at the end of the year to just let you know what's changing. And we'll do that with Lakeside later this year.
Yes, we will. And it is so important with everything that Audrey's saying. It's so hard to be in compliance, but we have to try to do all these things. And then having an employment practices liability policy as that last line of defense. So it is making sure that if you don't keep up with any of these things, something were to change, an issue happens, you do have an insurance policy that's going to cover you and pay for that. So your business isn't having to pay these massive fines out of pocket.
That's right. Okay, are you feeling overwhelmed? Well, yes, I totally get it. On to the next slide. I feel the stress. I look like that when I'm talking to my clients. Okay. But there's a handout, Jake. I think you can probably put that out for everybody who joined us. There's a handout with all the links. I strongly suggest you go to the website and just scan it to see if any of those info sheets apply to you and look at them every year because they change. But that's the way you're going to do it, is to get educated on what you're expected to comply with. So with that, does Cynthia have any questions?
And if anyone else has any questions, please throw them in the chat. We've got a few minutes, but Audrey, thank you so much. This has been a lot of information, a little overwhelming, even for myself. But it is important that we have to rely on partners such as Audrey and BBSI to be able to help us with these things. Working with Lakeside. I mean, again, there's things we didn't even touch on in this webinar that most of you are probably out of compliance with. Did you update your handbook this year? No, that's okay. You didn't have to update it, but did you have every employee sign the handbook?
Yeah, agencies are asking for signed handbook acknowledgments, particularly the unemployment division. So yeah, it's always wise to have your handbook updated, at least to have a look at it every year, update it whenever the new laws, like HOWA was a huge change. We had to update everybody's policies and family. Oh, family was there too. I don't want to forget that.
Yeah, thanks for that teaser, Audrey, because we're going to do a Colorado family webinar update closer to end of July, middle of August. So
that's right.
We're interested to see where the state's rate goes. Lakeside can provide private insurance plans for the Colorado Family Act. If you don't want to go with the state, we can typically provide a lower rate depending on your business and the employees that you have there. So again, let's all work together. Let's keep up with these laws here in Colorado. Thank you everybody for your time today. I know your time is valuable, so I hope you learned some lessons today. And again, any questions that you might have, I'll send out a recording of the webinar. It'll have my contact information, Audrey's contact information. We'll share the PowerPoint, and you can share that with your employees, any employer that you want to talk with. Looks like we got one question that came in.
Oh, yay.
All right. Sorry, two questions. I apologize, Wendy. I missed yours. What are the rules on lunch and breaks on employees that work on commission?
No different. And obviously they're not salaried, right? So if I'm an hourly employee, I still have the right to have breaks and lunches. So it's not any different. And the hard part about commissions is that, well, this is how the wage and hour division sees it. If I'm out there 100% commission, you still have to pay me for time worked. I can't go door to door and sell my products without you paying me for that, even if I have no sales. So the wage and hour division expects you to pay that, and with that, you're expected to comply with breaks and lunches.
And then one other question from Kate. She said our hourly employees are allowed to skip lunches if they want to, as long as we make sure they get an extra 30 minutes pay in the day they don't take lunch. Is that correct?
No, it's not. It's a flawed practice. It's nice, and I applaud you for being so kind to them. However, it puts you as the employer at risk that you're not complying with the law where breaks are supposed to be taken in the middle of the day. And even if you pay them, let's say you have one person says, I was out of, I wanted this is what people do when they have disputes with employers. They go, I wanted my lunch and my employer wouldn't let me. And if you have a practice like that, that means that you're not complying with the law. Therefore, the wage and hour division assumes that you're violating the law. So my advice is not to make that a practice, to make it exceptional and try and transition away from that so that you're not putting the company at risk. Because all it takes is one employee dispute to just mess everything up.
Thank you for that, Audrey. Hopefully that answered your questions, Kate and Wendy. And again, we'll get our contact information out. Thank you all for your time today. Have a great rest of the week and beginning of summer.
Yes, good. Have a great summer, everybody.